Good evening, everyone, and welcome to today's webinar. My name is Tim Cusick, and I am the Training Peaks WKO5 product leader, and I am just hosting today's webinar. Today we have Kolie Moore. Hey, Kolie. Kolie is going to be taking you through the balancing aerobic and anaerobic training. Great presentation. I've seen what he's done. Kolie is an amazing coach. He's part of our WKO5 Future Works team and helps us behind the scene continue to develop cool and new ideas in WKO. Really appreciate having you on today, Kolie. I'm stalling a little more, as you might see in the attendee list. People are still joining, but let's go ahead and get started. I'm going to turn off my camera and mute. I will be back for Q&A. You guys feel free to ask questions as we go. I might type some answers for people who have kind of administrative style questions, but I'll pop back on and I'm going to facilitate the questions to Kolie in the end. So I'm going to shut things off. Everybody, enjoy the show.
All right, thanks, Tim. Welcome, everybody. Okay, cool, big group. All right, this is going to be good. All right, so today we are going to be talking about balancing aerobic and anaerobic training. And as usual on Zoom, please type your questions into the Q&A box and not into the chat box. Tim will be taking care of the questions as we go. So I'm Kolie Moore of Empirical Cycling, as Tim mentioned. Thank you, Tim, for having me here. I'm the head coach and owner at Empirical Cycling and also host the podcast of the same name. And I am a WKO5 contributor, part of the Future Works group, as Tim mentioned. And thank you, Tim, for having me help you out with all this stuff. Actually, Tim's really helping me more. He's such a great coach and educator. Everybody, a moment of appreciation for Tim, because Tim doesn't really get his due all that often. So thank you, Tim, as always. All right, so as we go, opinions are like armpits. Everybody's got one, and everyone thinks everyone else's stinks, which is the obligatory opinion slide, of course. So this is a short way of saying that if you think I'm wrong here, that's okay, that's cool. I'm really presenting to you the same way Tim does, my thought process in all of this and how I think all this stuff works. And if you think half of it's good and half of it's not okay, then just take the half you want and you can leave the rest here. So we're going to be talking about aerobic and anaerobic training and the balance between the two. And the first thing we really need to do is think about defining the problem. So what is the balance here? The balance is, well, for instance, let's look at a couple things when they go wrong, right? So if you've done this, you've had a race experience like this, or perhaps you have coached somebody like this where they go into a race and they didn't have enough snap. You know, the group starts to take off and they're pushing as hard as they can and they're just losing places and they get shot out the back, low anaerobic power, right? So the other flip side of this is I was empty in the final, meaning you didn't have the diesel engine to get there with good legs. Even if you're a good sprinter, you know, you've got a good sprint, you can win the sprint, but if you've got the gas tank on empty, you've got low aerobic power, right? And so balance between aerobic and anaerobic training is actually having the appropriate fitness that you need to achieve success. And having the appropriate fitness requires measuring fitness. And this means we need to talk about our tools here. So when we think about tools, first we need to define what we want to track. We also need to find a way to measure what we want to track. And then we need to track our key metrics that we have. So pretty simple process. And so everybody can see that we are in the definition section of the webinar now, and we will go into the next two in a little bit. So here's what we're really doing when we talk about training. We are taking a stimulus in the form of a workout, and we're going to put it into the meat grinder of the athlete. And out the other side, we are going to find some adaptation. But we're going to talk about measuring stimulus and potentially adaptation a little bit later. But first, I think it's more important to think about physiology and performance, because these are things that we can really measure. We can measure performance with power and heart rate and speed and race results and all that kind of stuff. And performance reflects athlete physiology as much as athlete physiology can inform the performance. And as physiology changes, performance metrics change. And as performance metrics changes, we want to look at changing the athlete physiology more to meet the demands of an event. And the way that we do this is, of course, with data and metrics. These bridge physiology and performance. Now, data and metrics also have their own back and forth, as we're going to see. So when we think about data, we need to think about what we have and how much do we have of that thing, right? So what do you want to know is obviously the very first thing to think about. We need to define what we want to know. For instance, if we want to define aerobic performance, we can use FTP as a substitute. And that is a way to think about quantifying it. So can we measure aerobic performance? We can if we use FTP. That's just a for instance. And of course, with data, the big question is it individual? So just want to be careful of the fallacy of division here, where if you think something works for the average person, you want to be sure that it works for everybody individually. So you want to be able to tweak everything. So I think the Wikipedia version of the fallacy of division is Joe is a second grader. This second grade class likes ice cream. Therefore, Joe likes ice cream. Joe might be more of a cake guy. You don't know. So we need to not assign the average to the individual. So this means we need to make individual decisions for people. Why are we doing this? What works for these people? So can you see the training response and track it? That is a big question here. So this will allow us, of course, to optimize individual training outcomes. And you want to be careful, of course, of training to the metric or a test versus training for performance. And this can lead to rigid rule following, as my friend Patrick says. For instance, if you say you need to sprint well to win a criterium, but then you overtrain your sprint and you do no aerobic training, you are going to have a good snap and you're going to have no aerobic staying power to get to the end. So you followed a rule too rigidly, and we need to be able to balance these things. So thinking about balance, we need to think about aerobic and anaerobic adaptation, because a lot of the time when we think about aerobic and anaerobic, it sounds like there's a wall straight between the two metrics. And of course, as Tim always says, the reality is there's no such wall. There's actually a good deal of overlap between aerobic and anaerobic adaptation and performance. So here's one way to look at it. This is two charts that basically say the same thing. At all points of time, we have some contribution from all energy systems, aerobic and anaerobic. Excuse me. And so this is our first clue that the adaptation and the stimulus are multi-layered. They are not they do not have discrete boundaries, really, even though it says, these systems kind of have discrete boundaries. These energy systems all still interconnect. And we can kind of see the interconnectedness here in our very familiar training targets and classic levels, right? Because the Coggan levels and the classic levels, the I levels, whatever you're using right now, are a convenience. They describe, or they can be used to prescribe training by discrete areas of focus, because obviously it's going to be more difficult to assign a very nebulous area of the yellow-green here between sweet spot and tempo to an athlete. And you can just say, okay, we're going to work on threshold that's in this range. So despite that convenience, the reality is training targets are a continuum. And we see the same thing here in our expected physiological adaptations continuum. So zone 1 all the way up through zone, it seems we're missing zone 6. Somebody's got to put a chart up of this with zone 6 up on the internet somewhere, because this is the only one I find that doesn't have it. Okay, but anyway, we can see that despite the fact that we've got discrete zones, we also have pretty good arc. Let's say we start increasing plasma volume here, and sweet spot zone 4, zone 5, we really increase plasma volume, and zone 6 and 7 not so much, but we still get a little bit. So so this is the continuum and the discrete levels dichotomy that we kind of have to work with. So when we talk about these kinds of things, we need to understand the reality underneath the conveniences that we're using to describe training and also speak about it to each other. And so this is our model, right? This is the aerobic and anaerobic contribution to the PD model. So despite the fact that we just saw that there is really no discrete separation between aerobic and anaerobic, and with adaptations and energy systems and all of that, we still have this, because we have our aerobic curve. This is the FTP curve, the green one. We have our anaerobic curve, the FRC curve. This is the blue one. And when we sum them up together, we get the red PD curve for an athlete. And so this is a simple model. And as we just saw, if we want to get really nitpicky, this is a wrong model for the underlying physiology, but it's still useful because we can still use it and the subsequent aerobic and anaerobic metrics we get to describe and prescribe training and look at training load for aerobic and anaerobic adaptation and what comes out the other side, the adaptation and performance. And so every tool can be used as a hammer except a screwdriver, which obviously is a chisel, right? And so we need to, when we look at our metrics that come out of the PD curve, we need to think about the limitation, the flexibility of our tools, as well as their original purpose. And so we end up with questions like this. So is our PD curve, is it a chisel or a hammer? Can we actually use this to gauge response to aerobic and anaerobic training, despite that there is some overlap? The answer is obviously yes. Otherwise, what are we doing here? So the caveats, though, we have to think about are that the PD model is descriptive. It's not prescriptive. It won't predict what you can do. And, whenever somebody goes out and does a race or does a test, you hope they beat the model, right? So we can see improving fitness. And so as Tim harps on all the time, and I'm going to do it too, you have to maintain the model if you want to use it to describe and track fitness. It does not describe the training, though, just the response to the training. So we're going to look at this dimension in a little bit. The other warning is that small metric shifts are not always reflective of physiology. Like how many times do you see your FTP curve, for instance, do just drop 3 watts? Is that real? Your FRC goes up like 0.2 kilojoules or something like that. Is that real? Probably not, because our power meters can't even measure that small amount of error. Like who can gauge 3 watts at if we're going at 350 watts, right? So all models are wrong, but some are useful. And so we're going to look at some of the ups and downs of using the PD model for our purposes here. And that means that we're going to start talking about quantifying balance, because as Peter Drucker says, if you cannot measure it, you cannot improve it. And that's maybe not necessarily always the case, but for our purposes, that is pretty true. So here are some defined performance limiters, and this is incomplete, obviously. I spent literally 30 or 40 seconds on this and didn't look back, so don't take this as gospel. But I did a couple pretty deliberate things here with overlap, for instance, like looking at aerobic, the central components of aerobic performance. We have neuromuscular drive and neural drive over here in the anaerobic as well. And the same thing goes for glycogen storage and things like that. And so we have a couple options now. Are these performance limiters, so we're defining our performance limiters, but can we measure these and can we track these? Pretty much no, unless we are in a physiologic performance lab and we want to take biopsies and blood samples and all that kind of stuff from our athletes 9 times a day, which I don't think anybody really wants to do. So we have to nix the measurement and tracking for these types of things. So what can we actually do? With WKO5, we can actually measure aerobic and anaerobic performance by the metrics that come from the PD model. Well, except efficiency factor, obviously. If you're not using efficiency factor, by the way, get on it. It's very, very useful. So these are my personal primary and secondary aerobic and anaerobic metrics. So FTP, TTE, and efficiency factor for aerobic are probably pretty obvious and top of the list for most people too. And with anaerobic, we're also looking at Pmax and FRC. Secondary metrics for me are VO2 max and stamina. I look at them. Sometimes I'll put them as like a priority metric. Like if somebody's an ultra racer, maybe we'll look at stamina as a big factor. Otherwise, they're kind of in the periphery. To me, VO2 max and FTP are really well tied, so I can just look at one instead of both. And secondary anaerobic stuff, we're going to talk about glycolytic index and VLA max in this webinar, but we're not going to talk so much about repeatability. And one of the big reasons for that is just it's hard to measure. But if you want to measure it, here's just the shortcut version that I can advise that you do is you devise a workout, a standardized workout, and you tag it. And then you can get your metrics from the tags of these workouts. So don't want to spend too much time on this, but we can measure these things, right? And so now when we're looking at measuring our aerobic and anaerobic performance, the model And, I think as a convenience, we think about these as being on a seesaw. So if we decide to push up on the aerobic training, we decide to give the athlete more aerobic stimulus, we would think that there's a detriment or cost to the anaerobic side of things. Now, this especially is apparent in the PD model. And I have a semi-rhetorical question for you. Is this real? Is anaerobic and aerobic balance baked into the performance physiology, or is this balance more reflective of training focus? And as always, it depends, doesn't it? So what does it depend on? I'll give you the answer real quick, and then we'll spend some time exploring them. So for me, the aerobic anaerobic balance being baked into the athlete's physiology, this is more of a long-term thing. And I'll show you what I mean in a couple slides. But for the short term, and especially like within a season, to me, it's a lot more reflective of training focus, the balance between the aerobic and the anaerobic. And here's why. So an athlete pretty much has a given amount of energy and training time and recovery ability. And this means that we have to pick and choose our battles, right? Because let's say we have in a vacuum, let's forget anaerobic training for now. In a vacuum, if we just have what we consider optimal aerobic training and we ignore all the anaerobic stuff, what does it take to get this athlete from where they are now to race day with their absolute best aerobic performance? We have a certain type of training, right? And now if we do the same with anaerobic training, let's say we need this athlete on their race day to have their best anaerobic performance, and we're going to ignore aerobic stuff. What happens when we smash these two things together? We get suboptimal training the whole way down. So we have suboptimal anaerobic training and suboptimal aerobic training because this athlete is stretched thin. They don't have enough time. They can't eat enough food. They can't sleep enough. And you can't recover enough. So that's where we need to pick our battles with balancing aerobic and anaerobic stimulus and performance within an athlete's season. Yeah, too much. All right. So let's talk about understanding the PD model's balance. Now, the PD model, we can see some pretty obvious trade-offs in aerobic and anaerobic performance as we measure it by FRC and FTP, right? So here's an athlete season. This is their 2021 season. And my question for you as we go through this, I'm going to describe what happened, but keep this in mind. Did the athlete's anaerobic performance actually diminish? So really started to push hard somewhere around late January and had some summer racing goals. And so the TTEWC start going up. That's typical before we see a FTP increase. And then mid-May, late May, excuse me, we see the FTP starting to go up. It goes from about 330 watts to about 350 watts. And then this is why I picked this athlete, because right here, he goes to sea level. He's normally in Colorado, and then he goes to sea level, and now he picks up another 20 watts of performance. So now his FTP is at 370 watts, right? We see his FRC declining this whole time, right? So we do some preseason testing here, and we've got a pretty good idea of his FRC and his FTP. As we go, and his FTP starts picking up, is this actually a cost in his anaerobic performance? And we see it over here, his FTP peaks, and we see his FRC at an all-time low, and his Pmax is staying pretty steady. So is this real? Here's a blown up version of it. Now this is a better scale. So we can see when the FTP climbs, the FRC drops. And then when the FTP starts to drop, the FRC starts to come back up. So ask yourself the question, do you have your answer? All right, this is what happened. His sprint power, about the same. The yellow version is the 370 watts curve, obviously. The green version is the 330 watts curve. So between about a minute and a half down to his 1 second power, this is basically identical. And, this is a little low, the yellow version, the yellow curve, the 370 watt curve. But if I had asked him to test his 1 minute power here, he would have probably matched or beaten by a couple watts his previous best. So basically, these two things are identical. And the athlete's aerobic performance did not actually impact its anaerobic performance. What did it impact? It actually impacted the model, right? So what's happening here is we have PD model logic. If we have the same curve except for more aerobic work, this part of the aerobic curve here will actually increase the aerobic work that the model sees that the athlete is doing, and is decreasing the anaerobic work that the athlete's doing. And so the athlete's anaerobic performance has not actually been impacted. And I think that's very important to keep in mind, that when we look at these things in the short term, we might think, okay, this athlete's so strong aerobically, but oh no, look what happened to their FRC. It's not as big an emergency as you might think, as long as you look at the actual power performance in that range. And so, so the PD model logic here is really that the FRC curve gets smaller with greater aerobic performance, but that also means that the opposite is true, that the athletes, as an athlete's anaerobic performance gets better, if you're maintaining FTP and the athlete's gaining FRC or Pmax, then the model is going to think that the aerobic portion is getting smaller. And so we might see a drop in the FTP. All right, so now that we understand the model pretty well, let's talk about tracking our training balance and really getting into making some individualized training decisions. So again, this is what we're tracking. Stimulus goes into the meat grinder of the athlete, and now we've got to see what kind of adaptation sausage we get on the other side, right? Except we can't really track adaptation at the base level like we talked about before. We could really not measure those, but we could define them. So what are we really looking to do is we want to track performance, and we can try to look at stimulus as best we can. But first, we need to pick our priorities. So this is going to be a little 2-slide recap of prioritizing metrics and that kind of stuff, because we need to do it for the purposes of the webinar, but I highly recommend watching all of Tim's, because he's done some really good long in-depth versions of periodization. So, so let's say this is a criterium target with an athlete whose diagnosis was, I was empty in the final, got a good sprint. So maybe we don't have to work on Pmax, but we definitely need to work on that diesel engine. So we are going to prioritize FTP as the base of our fitness pyramid. And you can do one of these. You can have 9-level pyramid if you want. You can modify this any way you see fit. But because it still is a criterium, despite that this athlete might be a good sprinter already, they still need FRC. So that's going to be our second key metric. And of course, again, because it's a criterion, we might want to think about repeated sprint ability, RST, repeated sprint training. And so now that we have this, we can look at putting them over time, because we obviously can't do everything all at once, even though I'm about to show an example where we kind of had to. Optimally, we want to take a couple months to improve this athlete's fitness to its peak level. And so for each phase, like our base phase, we're going to want to look at endurance. So I have picked key metrics of EF, TIS, that's training impact score, impulse, and I'll show you a couple of charts on that in a second, and ramp rate as my key metrics. And then at a certain point, we're going to look at maintaining this as opposed to pushing it, because now, as we mentioned before, athlete has limited time, limited recovery, limited ability to eat. And so we're not going to be able to work on everything all at once, because it'll come at a cost. So then obviously metabolic fitness, we want to look at FTP and TTE and VO2 max, and then put those into maintenance. And now comes our race specific phase for this criterion. So we want to look at anaerobic capacity and repeatability. So I would look at FRC and maybe glycolytic index, but I'll show you how I do that in the long term, maybe not the short term. And then, of course, we want to work on making big power, as in FRC intensive, as Tim likes to call it. And so then we're going to look at FRC and Pmax as our main metrics. And then we're going to taper and peak. So that's a very short version of how we want to do this, or how we might do this optimally anyway. And so here's a version that was a little suboptimal, but I think is actually very informative. So this is an athlete's PD curve from 2019. And so this is a PD history metrics chart. And I want you to note that it's not the PD future metrics chart, right? So we can only describe what happened past tense. And so if we're on April 1st for this athlete, we don't know that their sprint's going to get better. We don't know their FRC is going to get better. We don't know their FTP is going to get better. We're sitting here hoping something's going to improve. And we want to look at how can we possibly, to the best of our ability, know that the athlete is going to have a good chance of really seeing improvement in the key performance metrics that we have, right? And so here's the short version of this athlete's season, by the way. So he asked me to start training him in March, so like mid-March. And before that, he was doing some skiing. He was doing some kind of general riding. And so here we see mid-March, we see his big bump in FRC, obviously not real, just a model thing. And his FTP starts to go up. And now this is his real baseline. He's got an FRC of around 22 kilojoules, and his FTP is about 330-ish watts. And then he starts training. His Pmax starts to go up. Very natural sprinter, very little work on his sprint. It just goes up. And his FRC goes up and his FTP goes up, right? And now we have some questions to ask, and we'll answer them in a little bit. But so basically, where was this athlete headed? In mid-June, he had a criterium series that he wanted to really do well in. That was his goal for the year. And so starting in mid-March to mid-June, we had 3 months to work. And that meant we really had to pick our battles in terms of priorities. And so that's exactly what we did. And now let's look at, I mentioned that we would want to estimate stimulus so that we could try to gauge as best we can that the athlete's going to improve from the stimulus of aerobic and anaerobic stimulus that we're going to be giving them. And so here we have the pretty typical anaerobic and aerobic training impact scores as we might normally see. I've got a little modification. I've got these counting here. It's a pretty easy function to implement if you want to try to do this yourself. But anyway, so we've got all these anaerobic 10s. We've got some mid anaerobic stuff. We've got a lot of aerobic stuff. We've got some 8s, some 7s, some 10s, some 3s and 2s and 1s. Now the question is, what can we do with this information? We can't really say, oh, you've been hitting some 10s lately, so you're going to improve, because I've seen athletes hit 10s lately, and that's enough to maintain, So we want to look a little bit deeper than this when we're trying to estimate aerobic and anaerobic stimulus. And so here's the way I've done it. So this is a TIS impulse chart is what I've called it. This is the aerobic one. So what I did was I took training impact score. I filtered out everything 6 and below. That's why they're all kind of dark here. These are the blue dots are the training impact scores on each day. Training impact score above 6, I applied a 21-day training load to them. And that means we have a training impact score impulse is what I call it. So what we're looking at is an impulse response because, our very basic periodization 101 and adaptation 101 is an impulse response model, the Bannister model, right? So that means MFTP is going to be our fitness response. And look, he starts with some aerobic riding, and we do some aerobic testing, and he's got his impulse going up and up and up. And his FTP is also going up in kind, and it kind of follows his CTL. But actually, I've seen in some cases that I like the impulse reflects the FTP a lot better than the CTL, because CTL obviously has context, but also, training impact score has context too. So we need to keep that in mind, that we don't know exactly the workouts that the athlete's doing. This could be an FTP workout. It could be sweet spot. It could be endurance rides. So you need to keep that in mind in the back of your mind. But as we go, we can actually divide up the TIS impulse and FTP response into 2 sections for his season. So right here, by the way, this little cluster of 4s, aerobic 4s, this is his actual, his race goal. It's a criterium series. So question is, how much aerobic focus did we have? And what kind of aerobic focus did we have? This here is really his aerobic intensive period. And so we're pushing on his aerobic system quite a bit, and we're seeing a good response. And now what do we see here? We see the aerobic impulse isn't growing, and we see his FTP is also not growing. And so this period here, right before his goal races, actually counts as aerobic maintenance. And what do we see here? That the impulse isn't going up. And so now we have a chronic target for aerobic maintenance. How cool is that, right? So this kind of chart can give us a lot of information on somebody's season and on and what we might be doing right. And also, if we look back, what might be going wrong. And we'll see an example of that in a little bit. But we can also do this anaerobically too. So we have anaerobic focus for this athlete. So this is the same thing. So now I said we had to make some training decisions because we only had 3 months, right? And so the training decision that we made was to entirely focus on him aerobically, or almost entirely, when it came to his actual workouts. And because we knew he was a natural sprinter and just doing some racing, his anaerobic performance was actually going to increase just by going to a practice criterium once per week. And that's exactly what happened. So his Pmax goes up through the season. In reality, this is right where it starts in terms of he's actually got about 1,500 watt sprint. And he's a natural sprinter. So as he sprints more, his sprint gets better. And it peaks, of course, right here around about 1900. So really, really good sprinter and 1900 watt sprint with a 360 watt FTP. I mean, this guy, he's genetically lucky, right? But because the FTP was going up, and we also see the FRC going up here, normally we would think that the FRC might be going down like we just saw with the model trade-offs. However, here it's going up, and this is mostly driven by the increase in Pmax, right? And so this also shows us one other thing that I think is really interesting. So remember we had the aerobic building phase and then the aerobic maintenance phase. Look, the anaerobic phase, this drops. So this actually is a little bit of a taper. Do you know why we did that? Because we did that in season. We didn't know this was going to affect the metric, but the metric reflects the planning really well. So we were thinking it's a criterium series. And so we need some aerobic maintenance and we need to push anaerobically, but we also need you to be fresh. And so he took a step back on the anaerobic stuff, and it was to his benefit because now we see a bump in his FRC and his Pmax when he gets to his races. So that was a really good example of using the aerobic and anaerobic impulse response to see what happened. And now if I were to train him again for next year, because he's an on-off client, it might happen, we'll be able to look back at the successes of what happened previously and get to work on using this as a planning tool. So speaking of using this as a planning tool, here we can see that this is going to be guiding some training decisions that I've made with an athlete very recently, actually. So I actually took this screenshot about 3 or 4 days ago. And what's happening here is this athlete is doing some base training. So he was doing a lot of low intensity aerobic training, November, December. And then he starts to push on, tempo and sweet spot and that kind of stuff, and some VO2 max here and there. And we're getting him ready to really get a really strong aerobic build. And what I did with this chart is I was looking at what were his bests the previous year. And so in 2020, his peak aerobic TIS impulse was 4.0. And so here, what I saw is that in December, we were getting into about the 4.0, 4.2 range. And so instead of resting him more through the holidays, we kept him training just a little bit, just enough to rest. And then we decided to push a little more as we were heading into January. And that meant that his 2021 peak for the TIS so far is 4.4. And not only that, but he's had a longer aerobic impulse here in December than he had in the previous year. And normally I wouldn't leave it so early either, except the fact that he needs to be in shape for April. So we're starting a little bit earlier than usual, but we're using the same principles when we are guiding training decisions. And should we push, should we pull? And also obviously had to make sure that he wasn't burning out and overtraining. So that's another thing to keep in mind. You cannot just train to the metric. You absolutely need the athlete feedback. So what else do we notice here? You see this? So FRC going up, FTP going down. What does this tell us? He's ready for build phase 2 because we need to rest him and now retest his FTP. We lost the model, right? We lost some points in the model that was keeping his FTP high and his FRC lower. So did his FTP actually drop about 20 watts? I mean, no, it really didn't. But I knew that the model was going to be wrong. And I knew that looking back on this in the future, I would remember, okay, yeah, we didn't test him because he was training pretty hard. So that's how this can help inform training decisions in season. All right, so let's talk about glycolytic index. Now, glycolytic index, I'm going to show you a chart on this, a physical chart in just a second, so we can see a little more easily how this is calculated. But glycolytic index is the measure of the rate of energy expenditure, as in kilojoules per second or joules per second, when glycolysis is the primary energy system. If you remember the green chart way back in like the 4th or 6th slide or something like that, if you're watching this later, you can go back and refer to that. Because you're going to see the same ATP, CP inflection point. And so this is measured in joules per second. So as in 500 joules per second, or as most people like to think in kilojoules, 0.5 kilojoules per second. Now, to me, glycolytic index in the short term is actually secondary to FRC and Pmax. And that's because the adaptations in anaerobic power are usually rapid, but they're actually pretty small, especially in people who are doing kind of middle intensity stuff. If you're a track sprinter, you're going to see some big changes. But if you're, because of the overlap in adaptations, if you're doing middle intensity stuff, sweet spot, FTP, polarized type stuff, little super threshold, VO2 max things, you're going to have plenty of these adaptations going around. So I find that FRC and Pmax react faster and describe fitness better. So we can use those as better guide points in season when we're looking at somebody's training. But as a long-term decision tool, I find glycolytic index to be incredibly useful. And we'll see a couple examples in a couple slides. So what's happening to you is that you're looking at anaerobic improvements in somebody and you want them to happen. Somebody needs more snaps, somebody needs more short-term power, they need more 20 seconds to push, something like that. If they're not happening, you need to look for limiters on and off the bike. Like we mentioned before, you need to be pretty fresh and feeling good to have good anaerobic performance. So if you've got stress, diet, life factors, overtraining, these are all factors that can really impact anaerobic performance negatively. Also off the bike, muscle mass is a big one. So muscle mass, of course, is one of the primary drivers of Pmax and FRC and things like that. So we can start thinking about incorporating these kinds of things if we're trying to improve somebody anaerobically in the long term and it's not happening. And glycolytic index can show us how that'll happen, or if we need to think about that kind of thing. So also, if your glycolytic index is improving when you are not intending it to, you have one of two cases, probably more, but this is just two I thought of for this webinar. So we've got a natural sprinter. I'm one of these people. The guy we were just looking at, he's one of these people. His 1900 watt Pmax, he's very much one of these people. Or your aerobic training might actually be more anaerobic in terms of adaptation, right? Because like we said, you do get some overlap in adaptation. And so if you're doing something like HIT, Tabata is yes, they do help a VO2 max, but at the same time, remember when Tabata, if you read the original Tabata paper, he was looking for anaerobic capacity improvements, not aerobic capacity improvements. He was using O2 to measure oxygen debt and deficit to see if anaerobic capacity was increasing because he was working with, I think, speed skaters. So when you do that kind of stuff, you are going to get some aerobic adaptation, but you also get big anaerobic adaptation. And so if that's what's happening to you and you don't want that kind of thing to happen, or it's too fatiguing or whatever, you want to look at the training modalities and the workouts that you usually have and make sure that they're really doing kind of what you intend them to do. If you want the overlap, great. If not, you can think about doing the separation, and you can use training impact score to kind of guide you there. So let's talk glycolytic index for a second. It has advantages and disadvantages, obviously, but first let's look at how it's calculated. So let's look at glycolytic index for this guy again. So we've got his, like I said, we've got his anaerobic performance is about the same. FTP difference 330 to 370 as he improves in training and then heads to sea level, and he gets that extra 20 watt bump. So look at this range of power here, right? And look at the slope of these two lines. They're about the same, right? And so now this is the same figure. This is exactly the same thing. The x-axis, look at this. This is no longer logarithmic, right? So we've got a logarithmic x-axis here. This is now linear. And this spot here, these two bars, this is actually the inflection point of the ATP CP inflection point that I mentioned on the green graph earlier. And this is also the border of Coggan eye level 7. And so right after this right here, this slope, we convert this actual mean max power into, from the PD model, we convert it into a kilojoule burn curve. And then we measure the slope of the curve. And so we have it up here, glycolytic index from these two different ranges, right? And so it's 0.60 and 0.63. And I show you this because if we look up here at what happened to this guy's FRC as his FTP went up, like we said, his anaerobic performance didn't actually decrease, but this is reflected well in glycolytic index. It's a little bit more independent of aerobic factors in the short term, especially. And it's more stable of a model than FRC and FTP because as things go up and down, as you are testing and not testing, the metrics will shift around. But especially over the course of years, glycolytic index is actually hugely informative. And again, we have, here's his actual FRC. So he went down 4 kilojoules, but the reality is his anaerobic power stayed about the same. All right, so now let's look at this in terms of long-term decisions. So on the left here, we actually have my data. Although you can ignore 2019, I didn't do a lot of training that year, but basically what happened was from 2012 to 2015, I was training as a road racer and I was a pretty natural sprinter. So we can see my glycolytic index increase from 0.6 to about 0.7. And after that, I decided to give up on aerobic training. I wasn't very strong. And I decided to really lean into my strengths, which was my sprinting. And so after that, we see my glycolytic index really start to increase as I've been focusing entirely on getting stronger and producing more power and kind of forgetting about aerobic performance. And now we have over here one of my athletes that I coach, a mountain bike pro. And in 2020, he came to me and he said the mountain bike version of I didn't have enough snap, which was this. I'm losing 30 places in the start. And so I looked at his Pmax, look at his FRC, and I look at his glycolytic index in the long term. So he started out at 0.58, pretty good. He goes up to 0.7 kilojoules per second. And now look at this, 18, 2019, 2020, he's stuck at about 0.7 kilojoules per second. And so we decided to make the decision that he's got a limiter off the bike. And so we started him doing some weightlifting. We started him doing some more sprint training. We did a little better periodization than he had done in the past in terms of aerobic and anaerobic focus. And aerobically, he was stronger than he had ever been. And more importantly, he had more anaerobic power than he had ever had because look, he's now at 0.84 kilojoules per second because he did a lot of focus on this kind of thing. So this is what I mean in terms of using it as a long-term decision maker, because it'll kind of tap out at some point for a lot of people. And if you really want to see some improvements, you're really going to have to push in that way. And VLA max, I use it as the same as glycolytic index. So I'm not going to show you 3 more slides about, making the exact same decisions. But VLA max, in my research on it, and I did an article for WKO5. If you want to read more about it, go check that out. I also did a podcast on it. So if you want to check that out at some point, it's the only one with VLA max in the title. But VLA max shows a lot more balance between Pmax and FTP. So VLA max is primarily determined by Pmax. And it is secondarily determined by your aerobic training. So if you take, for instance, 2 athletes who have the same sprint and one has 200 more watts of FTP, that athlete has a lower VLA max, despite the fact that they have the same anaerobic power. VLA max, in case anybody's wondering, does not actually determine your FTP. And so as we look at using VLA max, I would use it in the same way that I use glycolytic index in terms of determining an athlete target by their history, where have they been, and based on where do we want to go. So it'll more directly look at the difference between the two. So we've got just a quick report on an athlete. It's the athlete from the 2019 season. So we've got his FTP going from 326 to 354. It was actually about 360. The model was a little low. That's cool. About an hour TTE. FRC we see going up 1600 watts to 1900 watts Pmax. So we see glycolytic index going up as well as VLA max, and his FTP VO2 max ratio is just about the same. If you have any more questions on that, please ask them at the end. We are very nearing completion. So I think the last thing to think about here before we wrap this up is using this for an annual assessment. So I do a lot of consultations with athletes, and this is somebody who came to me last August and asked about his season, asked what he could have done better, because his goal races were in June. And he was really not in good shape in June. And so he was wondering, what can be done better next year? So let's take a look at what happens aerobically. Let's look at his aerobic impulse chart here. So in November, we see it staying steady at around 5.5, 6, 5, something like that, right? FTP is, this breaks my heart, 390 watts. Okay. So he's just chilling at 390 watts. And he takes a little rest and he starts to push. He starts to have a little more aerobic strain and stress. And we're estimating his adaptation. And we do indeed see a bump in his FTP up to just, average 425 watts. And it bumps up to about 430 as he goes into the season in March, right? His goals are in June. And what happens as he gets closer to June? He starts pushing harder anaerobically, but he's also fatiguing. And look at his CTL. It goes from like 150 up to near 200, right? And so what he's done, what I told him, is that he started on the second to top rung of the ladder, and he had nowhere to go when he started to try to improve himself, right? And so as he goes in the season, his aerobic impulse is going down. And eventually, as we expect, his FTP also starts to go down. And now we're into June and his FTP is dropping. And you need to be in aerobic shape to do well at a lot of, pro level events. And his shape was declining. And now if we look down here at the anaerobic chart, we look early, we see his anaerobic impulse was pretty low, as we would hope. Not pushing too hard anaerobically, probably just a lot of volume. And then over here, look at this. He's got an anaerobic bump, whereas above he's got no aerobic bump here for the same time period, right? So he's like, okay, I've got June coming up. I need to be in race shape, and I'm flagging, right? And so he starts to push anaerobically, and it doesn't really get him anywhere. And so June comes along, and he's not in great shape. And then things don't go well from there. And so he starts to train again. And I consulted with him right about here, and I said, dude, get off the bike. Take some rest. You need to be able to start at the bottom of the ladder in order to really push beyond where you had been before. And not only that, but also, what does the athlete want besides being in aerobic shape on race day for his goal races, in the middle of the summer? He wants to sprint well again. Let's look down here at his primary metrics. 2016 to 2021, we see his Pmax used to be in the 1400 watt range. And in 2019, 20, and 21, it had actually come down. And so he wants to be able to sprint better again. And so I told him, you should get in the gym. And that's just what he did. So heading into 2022, he's hopefully going to be starting from a little lower impulse. So he's got more room to grow into. And also he's been doing some off-bike stuff to address, this kind of the sprint limiter that he wants to have back. So all of this kind of shows some of our key points, right? So what is successful aerobic and anaerobic balance? It's individualized focus on each training area, aerobic and anaerobic, according to somebody's strengths, weaknesses, and goals, obviously. So this will hopefully lead to somebody having their appropriate fitness on race day in terms of not being gassed when you get to the sprint, or in terms of having the push that you need to keep up with the group or even win a sprint. And also long-term desired movement of metrics. Like if you want to become aerobically better and you don't want your big sprint anymore, you've got too much muscle mass, well, you've got some decisions off the bike to make as well. And so successful balance is achieved by, first of all, you have to define your limiters and goals. And then you've got to plan, you've got to periodize and prioritize your key metrics and how you're going to approach the season. And then you plan your training phases and your key metrics according to those. And then you can use tools like TIS Impulse and Training Impact Score in general, and CTL, FTP, and all of that. And you can look for training dose, for overload, and for maintenance as appropriate for the athlete. And of course, when it comes to understanding these metrics, we need to understand our tools and the strengths and limitations we have therein, right? Because we mentioned things like, training impact score. It doesn't tell you if you did an FTP workout or if you did an endurance workout. You might think that they're the same, but obviously, the reality is that they're not. So we need to think about these kinds of little deeper details. And until we have a really easy way to look at them with, gross high level metrics, descriptive performance metrics, something that we all just need to kind of keep in mind as we go. So that is it. And I hope that was informative. And I'm going to hang out as long as everybody wants. I will take some questions.
All right. Great work, Kolie. Thank you so much for presenting today. That was awesome. There has been some building questions. So what I'm going to do, this will be like rapid fire, dude. I'm going to read them to you and then you're going to be on the spot. This way, though, the good news is when we read them, when people watch this in the recorded version, they'll get to understand the question. There's been some building. I've answered a couple, but I've left most of them in here. And I have a feeling as soon as you start answering questions, you're going to get more. Trust me. I just
All right,
know
let's
from
go.
experience. All right, here we go. Question number 1. To what degree is fatigue resistance determined by aerobic power ability?
Actually, Tim, I think you're going to have a better answer than I will for this one.
Yeah, why don't you give your thoughts? And then I mean, I don't want to, I could add a thought or two, but yeah, no, what's your thoughts? I'm sure people want to hear, they hear my opinion all the time, dude.
All right. Can you read it back to me? It slipped my mind.
To what degree is fatigue resistance determined by aerobic power ability?
Aerobic power. Interesting. So, it's funny that when you say aerobic power, it depends. What do you mean by aerobic power? Because if we're talking like VO2 max power, if you look at a high level pursuiter and you ask them to, compete in the Tour de France the next day, they're probably not going to be able to. You got to spend some time, working on this or working on that. So, at some level, I think for a lot of people, fatigue resistance, especially the amateur level, can come from more aerobic power in general. Because if your FTP is 200 watts, you're going to be able to do 150 for a certain amount of time. But if your FTP is 300 watts, you can do 150 watts for a lot longer, and when you're working with like a pro and their VO2 max is kind of stuck, you've kind of got to make a decision. Do I want this person to pursuit better, or do I want them to have more endurance?
I think that's a very good answer. It's a tough question. And I know the challenge when people use a verb, like a name, they name something and it's a pretty broad, like aerobic power.
Yeah.
I would think the reality is the higher your aerobic fitness, the more likelihood you would have fatigue resistance, but that still would need to be teased out and developed through training, particularly training over time.
Yep.
That's my answer. All right. Next question. What are your thoughts on using stamina, I guess, as a metric? So what are your thoughts on using the metric stamina for stage racers?
I like it, actually. It has, it doesn't seem to move that much in season. But it's one of those things where like glycolytic index, I use it over time, year to year kind of thing, to make sure that, we're going in the right direction for somebody.
Again, I think that's a great answer. Next question. Can we see somewhere how certain numbers are calculated, e.g. stamina, EF for running, question mark? And that might be one I have to tackle at least half of.
Yeah, go ahead.
So you guys, in the power duration metrics, we do not show how we calculate if they're driven by the power duration curve. Now, Mario, you list EF. EF is just normalized power divided by heart rate. That's not a complex one, and that formula is pretty commonly out there in the world. But stamina is a power duration metric. It is simply the rate of drop off of power at FTP. But we don't talk about how, we don't broadcast how we measure it. Okay, next question. It is conceivable from a physiological point of view in the long term that anaerobic training reduces oxidative capacity cellularly.
Is that a question or just a?
I think it was meant to be the other way. Is it conceivable from a physiological point of view?
I mean, yeah, if we want to get nitty gritty on the physiology, and I mean, that's my bread and butter sometimes, even though Tim has been helping me to wean myself off of that habit. Yeah, like it's funny because I've been looking at my own aerobic metrics since I've been really pushing hard on the sprint stuff. And because, I'm the best example I know of somebody who pushed really hard aerobically and now is pushing really hard anaerobically in terms of people I've got data for. So, my FTP is still the same percentage of my VO2 max as it was like when I quit doing endurance training. So, and on paper, you would think it's the opposite, but maybe it's the tools that, in WKO5, maybe it can't measure it that accurately, but, in theory, yes. But when it comes down to it, that's one of those long-term metrics because, in the long term, fiber type will shift. We'll get different differences in muscle capillarity, and we'll get differences in, type 2 fibers can be actually pretty oxidative, by the way. They can have a lot of mitochondria. They're not the best fat burners typically, but they can be really oxidative. So, in theory, yes, but at some point you've really just got to think about what is the athlete's performance and are they able to even shift these metrics? Because I've worked with some people who we get them in the gym, we get them doing sprint training, and we can't even move their P max like more than 100 watts ever. So, at some level, you can have all your ivory tower academic thoughts as you want, and I have more than my fair share. I've got enough for everybody here, actually. So, but at some point, you've got to think, all right, what are we actually going to do to help these people, get faster? And you can't measure these things either. So you just got to work with the metrics that you have.
Yeah, I think that's a great answer. And in both of your last two answers, just add a comment. I think when you do a webinar, and I get into this struggle all the time in education, and you have to talk about something and you put a slide has this idea like it's a point on a continuum. And what it makes people think, like, if I do this tomorrow, I'll have results the day after tomorrow type of thinking. When the reality is a lot of this stuff is bigger picture. It's beyond a week, a micro, a macro cycle. It is years of change that can be benefited. So if you go back to this idea of fatigue resistance and building an anaerobic and aerobic balance, impact that you're really talking about, you should be thinking not just one season, but longer. A lot of what Kolie was showing here, which is the strength behind why he's such a great coach, is you notice when he really dug into his information, it wasn't like, here was last month. It was, here's the last 5 or 6 years. He's looking at that skyscraper view. He's looking down over the top of all the people walking around in the street, right? That is so important to do as a coach when you're thinking about this stuff. So
well, not only that, but when you're looking at what changes a physiologic metric, like just aerobic or anaerobic performance, just to put them in, very broad terms, there's a lot of stuff that goes into it. And we have a lot of information at the physiologic level, but we don't have all the information. And so if we act in such a way that we're trying to use the information that we have, we're actually going to be stymied pretty well by the information that we don't have. We have a lot of known unknowns and we have a lot more unknown unknowns, as it were. And so, it's really, really hard to kind of build up to, physiologic principles and training principles from first principles of, muscle cells.
Agreed. All right, next question. Is there a chart where you can see the change of VLA max by time on a timeline?
I had one, Tim. I actually emailed you to see if you could build me an expression for this, because I had built the expression for it and it took so long to calculate.
That's the problem.
I had to nix it. I was looking at it, but then I was like, I can't do this. So I've just got it in my report and that's it. Otherwise it takes forever. But ask in the Facebook group, a lot of people there will be able to make one of those. And the same actually with stamina. I had a stamina tracking thing for a little while and it took so long to calculate. I was like, I got to throw this out.
Yeah, some charts people don't realize. I mean, think about how big one fit file is, and imagine if you had to read every second of that fit file and then make a rolling average of it, and then weight that average of it. You really need a pretty big computer to do all that work, and then pull that up to over the last year's worth of training. That's a lot of calculation. Yeah. All right, next question. As we know, every power meter is measuring different. How do you correct the data in WKO5 if a power meter measures higher or lower than another?
I either throw it out, or I separate the two, like this, TT bike or a mountain bike over here versus, road bike over here. I keep them separate. And, if one is like pinging a suspicious number, like I'm like, I don't think this person actually gained 40 watts of FTP. I'll put a little asterisk there, be like, maybe this is not real. And every time I do my history, I'll be like, oh yeah, that year. Yeah. So there's not a great answer, and you can really drive yourself nuts trying to actually tweak these kinds of things because you need a reference power and we don't have one.
Couldn't agree more. Great advice. Worse than having no power is having incorrect power.
Yes.
Every time, because no power doesn't lead you to a decision or assumption. Bad numbers lead you to bad decisions.
Yep.
All right, next question. Some good ones coming up here. How does heavy strength training, and especially its timing, fit into the balancing equation? Can it actually help aerobic performance? Question mark. So that's actually the question. There's some other anecdotal points.
Can it help aerobic performance? Yes, it can, mostly through neural drive mechanisms. So a lot of studies have shown that people doing some strength training along with blah, blah, blah can really help aerobic performance, even though their VO2 max isn't going up and their threshold's not going up. It can help with power output, just raw power. So it can increase the anaerobic performance, the anaerobic contribution to aerobic performance for sure. But when it comes to periodizing that kind of thing, and fitting it in a week, I wrote an article called "The Risks of Concurrent Training" on the Training Peaks blog. So check that out. That'll have the answers for you, I hope.
Okay. Next question. When planning a workout, is there a good way to predict / estimate TIS?
I hate to use Andy's phrase.
Oh, it's the perfect answer. Go for it. Phrase. I could even write it down.
The best predictor of performance is performance itself. So if you do a 2x20 and you see a 6, you go, okay, cool. That's my 6. All right, 2x20. What happens if I do 3x20? I get a 7. I get an 8. Great. If you do 3x20 in 3 hours or 4, is that different than doing it in 2? So just look at what a workout kind of gives you, and you can estimate it like that.
I couldn't agree more. Great answer. I'm sorry, I don't mean to jump in. That's like what you just said in its simple form is so powerful. Why data and data analytics, why it's still an art. As a coach, you simply are using that information. The workouts we're looking in the past, we didn't create a TI. We didn't say, oh, and put magic TIS score to it. That's what you actually did. Therefore, it's predictive of what you should do. It answers the question for you. So great answer.
Yeah. I remember when we were working on TIS, that was one of the discussions that we had frequently.
Yeah. It was like, well, how will we know? And it's like, look, and that's what happens. It's like, if it's 40 degrees out, you learn to put on, an extra layer before you go out and ride your bike. Cause eventually you identify 40 degrees is cold. I need a vest, right? Or whatever.
Give me 40 degrees. Let's go.
Yeah, exactly. 4 right now.
Yeah.
All right. Sorry. I'll be quiet from here on in. Steve asked the question, why did you choose 21-day time constant for the TIS impulse model?
Oh, it's funny. Every time I ran through this webinar in practice, I mentioned that and I forgot this time. So good question, Steve. Thanks. I'm sure Tim predicted this, which is that people usually train in 3-week blocks. That's the simple answer. So you can estimate the impulse of a 3-week block. Voila.
Okay, next question. Say you have a goal to be aerobically fit, no effect of anaerobic power in the goal race, say a long TT or Ironman. Is optimal training to neglect anaerobic training or limit it to a bare minimum? Question mark.
That is a very athlete dependent thing, because I train some TTers who do great when we give them HIT, like intermittent type work and like high power intervals along with their regular TT stuff. And I train some people where it wouldn't make a difference if they did it or not. And so, their VO2 max type work is their super threshold work. And, we call it a day. We make sure that they can start well and handle any little climbs that they've got on course. But it's something that needs individualization. It needs that like coaching art rather than this works for everybody, because that's the fallacy of division, right?
Excellent answer. Next question. There is evidence now that anaerobic is taking much more importance in mountain bike cross-country races. And in the past, we used to reserve anaerobic training later in the training phase. We now tend to start anaerobic and FTP, FRC much more early in training, even starting in January. What are your thoughts on that?
I mean, what do you think I'm doing with my pro mountain bikers who need sprint work? We're doing sprint work because they need to work on it. Their PMAX isn't high enough. Their FRC is not high enough. They're getting dropped on short, punchy hills. Like for instance, like my girlfriend's a coach too, and we were just riding mountain bikes and somewhere warm, obviously not up here in Vermont, but she was dropping me on every hill because I was just suffering. And then we had like a short little punchy hill. I dropped her so bad on a 20-second hill. And she was like, oh, that's what sprints are for. Oh, I get it. And so, yeah, like that thing is real in mountain biking, especially in the start for cross-country races and, cyclocross races and things like that. And so, it depends on what the athlete's good at too. I train people where if we only give them steady state FTP work, they can jump into a mountain bike race or a criterium and they can crush it. And there are people who need to get that kind of intermittent work all year round. We'll do endurance with accelerations, like or tempo with bursts or something like that as like a regular ride, to kind of train this stuff. And we're not neglecting the aerobic training. We're just kind of trying to fold it in without creating too much fatigue if that's something they need to work on long-term.
Excellent. All right, next question. I'm skipping around a little, trying to get through the questions that we have. You mentioned EF is very important to track. What do you look for in it? Question mark.
I look for it trending up or not trending up, as I am hoping it will be doing. And if it's not, then I think it might be time to move on, or it might be time to rest, or why is this not moving up? I'll dig in for a reason.
Great answer. I have an athlete that needs to shift some weight. We have been using fasted aerobic rides with some success. Oof. What are your thoughts on fasted anaerobic sessions?
Terrible idea.
I'm going to vote with Kolie. You can go after this one, dude, because if I see this question one more time, I'm going to jump off my roof, make energy with carbs.
I am a big proponent of never doing fasted training unless it's like a recovery ride. That's it. That's the only thing where you wake up in the morning, maybe it's like 4 a.m. You want to spin for an hour to, wake your legs up or wake yourself up or whatever at 50 watts. Fine. Harder than that, you probably need to eat, especially when it comes to making anaerobic power. Like even a 5-10 second sprint creates a huge amount of lactate. And I saw this when I was doing VLA max testing. I could sprint for 5 seconds and I could have a blood lactate concentration of 12 from a baseline of like 3 or 2. And you need carbohydrates to do this kind of work. And when it comes to weight loss, actually I just put out a podcast like last December, I think. Just this past December, fat max fallacies, where I go into, does burning more fat, which happens when you are doing fasted rides and stuff like that, does that actually help you lose weight? Does that actually help you have aerobic improvements? We dig into it a little bit there, but generally speaking, no, you never ever want to do anything fasted, especially anaerobic stuff. Like even lifting weights or sprinting on the track, you're doing like on the track, what you do a minute maybe of hard work over 3 hours. You know what you're doing in between? Eating candy, drinking Coke. That's what you're doing.
I couldn't, just to say it, I couldn't agree more. Now, if you need to manage weight with a client and stuff like that, and you should be a nutritionist to do that. And then two, you can manage calorie deficit, you can periodize carb intake to some degree, but you're also just playing with fire. That's all I'm telling you. But we'll go from there. All right, next question. How long do you recommend testing to make aerobic and anaerobic metrics more exact?
As
I
needed.
think he means in the model. Model testing.
As needed. Usually if you push on a system for maybe 4 to 8 weeks, it's probably time for a test, and you might want to do it like for a residual or something. Like if I think somebody's FTP has gone up, their TTE has gone way, way out, and they've done the right work and yada, yada, I'll be like, go out and do a 20 to 30 minute time trial. Because if I give them something like a FTP test by feel, they're so used to hitting that number that they've been hitting for the last 2 or 3 months. A lot of the times they have a mental block going past that. So I just say, go time trial for your life, and, go hit your favorite climb or whatever, and we'll use that as a test metric. But you do want to test, especially if, for anaerobic stuff, the training is the testing. You're always going as hard as you can with the anaerobic stuff. And so that's, so you don't really need to do too much testing with that unless you want to. So.
And this is part of the next question. Do you notice that maybe sometimes the model gets a little stagnant in that testing? Like let's say you're on top of your testing and you're doing other stuff, but you ever notice that it gets a little stagnant even with residual check testing? And is there a way that you can kind of cure that?
Usually that's reflective of an athlete's physiology starting to stagnate.
It's the athlete that's stagnant, right?
Yeah. Yeah. The model is descriptive. It's a history. It's not predictive. If you're thinking I should be getting faster because X, Y, Z, and you're not, well, the model's tracking your fitness, right? Do you trust the model to track your fitness or not?
I'll tell you one thing I noticed: when your model stays, you literally usually are in a form of training stagnation or training monotony. It's one of those two that's driving the fact that your model is not changing.
Yep.
All right, next. Thanks again. You're welcome. Next one. I'm going to ask this question, but you don't have to answer it. Let's go with this one's rhetorical, right? What do you think of fasting for zone 1 and 2 long rides to improve aerobic fitness, since it helps on oxidating more fats?
Check out Empirical Cycling podcast, Wattstock number 35, Fat Max Fallacies. I think it's 35 anyway. Listen to that one. Plug myself while we're at it. No,
that's good. Plug away. Your podcasts are so awesome.
Thank you.
Hopefully all the WKO people are following them. And I'm going to ask you to plug again in about 4 more questions.
Okay.
So literally, at this point, the next question is, what do you think fasting of zone 1, 2 long rides to improve aerobic fitness, blah, blah, blah. Oh, I see. Wait, it's just a repeat. It came up on my screen twice.
Gotcha.
So, but that go on. This is a deeper version of the question. I've recently read in some articles that in a race, when they attack sprint, they attack sprint, but this will end up using glycogen anyways. Mm-hmm. Yeah. So you guys want, and I'm tackling this because we total separate worlds. Kolie and I have been arguing this. I'm literally becoming more and more vocal. I don't normally get engaged in internet and public arguments, but I'm getting close. Yeah, that's what happens. If you're in a road race and I'm doing zone 1, 2 rides all the time, totally fasted. And yeah, let's just say you could make fasting work. And then you jump in a road race and the smackdown goes down time and time again. I'm going to tell you what's going to happen. You're not going to have the fuel or the energy to do it, because all you've been doing is you're in low carb availability. You're just teaching your body that's the new norm. You don't have the fuel that you need. You're not fueling the system well. You will pay the price in that race. You don't have the system.
I advise that people check out Louise Burke's 2 studies on race walking. She did keto intervention, low carb periodization kind of stuff. Thank you. Yeah, it's if it worked, we would have seen it there, because she had a really, really good study protocol.
Great study. Great point. Okay, next question. Addition to the EF tracking question, should the improvement be visible on weekly or block or macro basis? Doesn't the buildup of fatigue influence it? So that's a good add.
It does and it doesn't. I track EF in many different time durations. So I track it over a week. I track it over 30 days, 45, 60, 90, 365. Well, 365, you get into year to year kind of weird stuff. But yeah, I track it over different periods and, what you've been doing with the athlete. If somebody had a week off, they've got a week of no data, something like that, or they've, shifted focus or something happened, the data is all contextual. So you have to think about what's actually been happening, at a deeper level.
Okay. Just to put it, because somebody keeps putting in fasted questions now. We're not going to answer any more of your fasted questions. Sorry. We're just not a supporter of it. Okay. Good answer. Is there a benefit of drink mix with lactate to be used as a fuel source, i.e. Cytomax, in addition to sugars?
I'm not a nutritionist, but I would say probably not any different than just eating any other food.
I would agree. Have you worked with clients with cardiac arrhythmias? I wouldn't, you guys, the hardest, I'm going to not even let Kolie answer that one because it's a WKO webinar. The most important question is work that out with your doctor and have the doctor guide the training. Athletes who have cardiac arrhythmia, there's risk factor there that you should be aware of. All right, Kolie, here's a good one. What's a good EF number?
I mean, it depends on the athlete. It always depends. The answer is it depends. For every question, it depends. So what it depends on here is what does the athlete's heart usually do? What size is it? So how fast does it beat to supply the needed oxygen? And also what power do they make? Like somebody's heart can beat, like Chris Froome's heart can like max at like what, 165 or something like that. And he's putting out like 400 something watts. Mine doesn't do that. So his EF is going to be, 400 whatever divided by 165. And my EF is going to be, if I was at 165 BPM, I'd probably be at like 150 watts. So mine's going to be basically 1 and his is going to be like 4 or 2.5 or something like that. So it depends on the person. I don't compare between people. I always look at just what's the trend. The number itself doesn't tell you much.
Exactly. The answer I would give is a better one than yesterday.
Yes.
You are the platform. You are the know your numbers and just move them forward. That's always a great answer. All right. Last question. Is there a reason not? Oh, wait. And this one's me. Guaranteed this one's me. Is there a reason not to cache, remembering this for later use in software, metrics, which take a while to calculate and have it available without recalculating? No, and typically in software, we cache, like in WKO, we cache as much as we can. But think about it. Every time you add a new file with so many calculations being done on 1 second data, you have to scan that file and see if it changes anything. And then if it changes anything, it changes everything. So all your recache, you are holding all your historical data in caching, and then you still have to recalculate the model and then the outputting information. So we do a fair amount of caching in WKO5. It's the absolute way to improve calculation. If you are working in any analytics, I don't care if you're creating a WKO competitor, I'll give you a clue here, right? It is really the size and scope of the core fit file itself and the amount of data. People underestimate fit files because you see like a Garmin calculating a fit file. They're much bigger file. There's a lot more data to be read. It's not as easy as it looks, because then put a couple of years of those together and it gets hard. I think that's it. So Kolie, where do we find out more about you? Where can we learn all your great teaching and stuff like that? Give us the plug, the shameless plug. Please do it.
Just head straight over to empiricalcycling.com. Most people will probably want to listen to the podcast which is up under podcast episodes. We do some interviews. We do some deep dives into physiology. Me and my podcast co-host or whoever I've got on, we'll banter and we'll give some practical advice. We've got some strength training stuff there. We've got a lot of stuff planned for the next year. And of course, I've got some articles up there, previous webinars, other coaches who have, who have written papers. They're all up there. So you can learn a lot on the empiricalcycling.com website and get in touch with me there too. Why not?
Awesome. Well, thanks for giving us the time and such great knowledge today, Kolie, and thanks everybody else for joining. We've got some other great webinars. Keep checking the WKO5 Power User Group, and we'll post them there. Thanks, everyone.
All right. Thanks, Tim.
Bye now.